What a great thrill and a great honor to be together with you today, and I'm really absolutely grateful. Pak Budiono, so wonderful to see you, and our dear Murray Pangestu, one of our favorite ministers of this country, and World Bank leaders, and very renowned world specialist in economics. And ladies and gentlemen, it's wonderful to be back in Jakarta for me, and also at this very important and a bit strange time in the world. This is a very unusual moment in world history, a complicated time, unfortunately also a dangerous time. So I'm really very, very happy to see the intensity of concern and analysis that is taking place in Indonesia right now. What to do? How can Indonesia move forward in a very complicated geopolitical environment and a rapidly changing technological environment? And most importantly, how can Indonesia achieve good lives for all of the people of this wonderful country? And I'll put it in shorthand, how can Indonesia achieve sustainable development? Because I take sustainable development to be the framework for thinking about good lives. You know, when the Sustainable Development Goals were being negotiated between 2012 and 2015, the then Secretary General of the United Nations, Ban Ki-moon, set a commission to discuss sustainable development, and I always very much liked the name of the report of that commission. It was called The Future We Want. So the idea of the Sustainable Development Goals is really to build the future we want. And that is a future that I think has shared ideas and hopes all over the world, which is why it was possible for all 193 UN member states to agree on the Sustainable Development Goal framework at the end of 2015. So I want to define a little bit of that framework and then discuss what it means for Indonesia, of course, and what the challenges are in the world more generally for sustainable development. I take sustainable development to mean four things all together. So it's a comprehensive or holistic idea. One is quite straightforward. We heard it from the young man just a moment ago. He wants a better income. He wants higher living standards. Why not? So economic development is the first pillar of sustainable development. The second pillar of sustainable development is social inclusion or social justice, or as we say every day in the UN, leave no one behind. The idea is that when you look at the average growth of an economy, it doesn't tell you, is that a few people getting very rich and everyone else staying poor, or is that broad-based progress? Is it the men getting ahead but not the women? Is it some social groups or religious groups getting ahead but not others in the society? And the idea of sustainable development as an ethical idea and as a practical idea for a good society is that everybody should be sharing in the progress. When that's not the case, not only is it unjust, but it's also very destabilizing. And in the United States, my own country, we've become two different societies almost in the last 40 years. Part is doing very well, thank you, and another part is really suffering. And you see that in every indicator. Incomes rising for usually college-educated households, but stagnant or falling for those who have a high school diploma but not more. Life expectancy rising for those with a university degree. Actually falling, declining life expectancy for those whose top educational attainment is high school or less. So we've become two societies in the United States. And so this is not what we want. The third dimension of sustainable development is the environmental dimension, and it's become central for our reality, not because we've all become lovers of nature, though nothing wrong with that, but because we are in a very, very advanced stage of environmental crisis, in fact. And the basic reason for that is that we have had a pattern of economic growth and resource exploitation for more than 2 centuries that didn't really pay very much attention to the environment. And certainly we didn't know even how to set the rules for the economy so that one could make progress economically, but also protect the environment at the same time. This has been going on now for, I would say, 200 years since the steam age began in England. And then the fossil fuel age began with the internal combustion engine and with the gas turbine and all of the massive increase of industrialization that was unprecedented, something never before seen in history. And along with that came a massive increase of the world population, roughly 10 times larger today than it was in 1800 when all of this industrialization began. And so we've got a lot of people and a lot of resource use per person, and we have reached several very, very significant, very dangerous environmental crises. And Indonesia is not a simple place environmentally. It's a unique system of ecosystems. It's extraordinarily fragile. It's extraordinarily beautiful. It's extraordinarily at risk in this period, partly from what's happening within Indonesia itself, how the economy works, but very heavily from what's happening globally, because Indonesia has a few islands, as you know. I think the count is 17,000, but I may be wrong. And the sea level is going to rise by several meters, most likely in the next couple of centuries. And this is going to be a colossal crisis everywhere. I also live on a small island called Manhattan, and if we have this rise of sea level as expected, the lower part of Manhattan will be underwater, deeply underwater. We also have our floods, and we never really fully recovered from a massive flood 12 years ago, a great storm that we had that caused about $50 billion of damage, and they thought they were pretty sophisticated on Manhattan, able to handle things. They left the backup generators of the hospitals in the basements, for example. So the hospitals lost power. We had disasters all over the place. And my own sense is that and it's not just my sense, it's quantitatively known, we're having massive environmental crises everywhere in the world now. You can't go to any place that doesn't have some record heat wave, some record drought, some record flood, some increased spread of dengue or some other diseases because of the temperature dependence. And so this is becoming absolutely startling. And our politicians have not been very good at understanding any of this, and even worse at reacting to it. And there's nothing in the global economic system by itself that is an antidote to these environmental crises, because the market system that is the dominant economic system, which is make profits, does not pay attention to the environmental costs that are imposed, especially the greenhouse gases that are emitted into the atmosphere that are warming the planet, or the trees that are deforested to make way for more palm or for some other crops and so forth. The market system just by itself cannot address these issues. And when the market system was highly praised as the right way to run an economy by Adam Smith in 1776, the idea was we have limitless land, we have limitless resources, ocean, land. What difference does it make? We can just expand. And that, we know, is not the case. So this third dimension of sustainable development is very real. We've been talking about it for decades. I don't think we've even changed the direction yet, frankly. We still have rising greenhouse emissions. We have an accelerated warming of the planet. And as I'm sure everybody knows, last year was the warmest year in record history, but probably the warmest year on Earth in the last 125,000 years. We use the phrase to keep warming at no more than 1.5 degrees Celsius compared to the so-called pre-industrial temperature. Well, that's a scientific idea, and the proxy that's used is the average temperature between 1850 and 1900. Well, last year was 1.48 degrees Celsius, 1.48 warmer than the pre-industrial temperature, partly because of the El Nino, but also partly because the underlying warming trend has accelerated. And we're going to push right past the 1.5 degrees Celsius limit. Will we stop at 2 degrees, 2.5 degrees? Nobody knows yet, because we're not on a trajectory of safety. And just to make the point, these environmental crises come in many forms: the global warming, the loss of biodiversity, the disruption of the ecosystems, whether it's the forests or the fisheries, both of great consequence for this country, and so on. And the massive pollution as well: chemical pollution, pollution of the coast, pollution of the air in our cities, and so on. So that's the third pillar of sustainable development: get the environment right. Very hard, but very core. And the fourth pillar of sustainable development is SDGs 16 and 17. SDG 16 is peace, and SDG 17 is partnerships, as you heard just a few minutes ago. Peace and partnerships. So, what to do? If you look globally at the situation today, well, the SDGs are not in good shape, not surprisingly. And that's basically true just about everywhere. We're not achieving what we set out to achieve in 2015, and there's very little prospect that by 2030 these goals will have been achieved, more than a few of the goals in a few places. And it could make you cynical, certainly. You could say, well, that was a dumb idea, or isn't that just like the United Nations, you know, setting nice things, high-minded, but what does it really matter? And I have to tell you, I don't have that perspective on the SDGs. I spend morning till night working on them, and have since they were first proposed as an idea a dozen years ago. Because what else are we going to do? It's not like saying, well, we're not meeting them, so forget about it. It's rather saying these are really the right goals for the world. They're extremely important. What should we be doing, and what can we be doing to make the future we really want and need? And that brings about, I think, maybe the first piece of good news in all of this, which is that the Sustainable Development Goals and this framework are absolutely achievable. That's the paradox. We're not achieving them, but not because they're so hard or naive or idealistic. We're not achieving them basically because our social and political and economic systems need to be changed in order to achieve them. We need to do things in a different way, but in ways that are identifiable, that are practical, that are cost-effective, that are not impossible to do. And that, to my mind, is the best news. This isn't some idealism that says, wouldn't it be lovely? And then somebody else says, yes, but it's impossible, so let's go have a coffee. This is, wouldn't this be wonderful? Yes. Well, how could they be achieved? Well, very practically, we could do the following things. And then, why aren't we doing them? Well, because the economic system isn't yet organized properly for this. Government isn't doing exactly what it should be doing. So what is really the point? The point is we have to do things differently from how our normal economic, political, and geopolitical system works. Let me start quickly on the geopolitics, and then I will put that aside. The biggest problem in the world is that the major powers need to cooperate with each other and need to abide by international law, the UN Charter. Well, that's not impossible, but it's not their mindset. And unfortunately, it's really not the mindset of the United States, which got the idea when the Soviet Union ended 33 years ago that now we are in charge. Well, we're not in charge of anything. But the American leaders think, well, we're the world leader, we're in charge. But obviously, we can't even run our own country, much less anything else. And so the mindset needs to change from the idea we're in charge to the idea we had better cooperate. So what is actually the steps to achieve, what are the steps to achieve sustainable development? In one word, I would say investment. In a few words, I would say investment in people, investment in infrastructure, and investment in sustainable businesses, the three. And to my mind, this is basically an investment program. And an investment program needs to be designed, it needs to be financed, and it needs to be implemented properly. And it's got a major public component, that's why government is so important, and it's got a major private component as well. That's why the private economy is also so important. And what Pak Budiono said a few minutes ago, I just want to completely 100% subscribe to. When you're talking about an investment program, there are no shortcuts. Investment isn't something you do in 6 months or a year or 2 years. It's a generation we're talking about of major investments that need to be undertaken to achieve sustainable development. And I count 6 major investments. And the first one is what really brings us here. It's first and it's the most important by far. and it's the investment in people. It's the human capital investment. There is nothing else like it. Doesn't matter how much oil, coal, nickel, anything else you have. If you don't have a trained, well-educated population, there cannot be development. And to put it conversely, if you have nothing, no resources, no fossil fuels, no minerals, you're importing everything. If you have a well-trained population, doesn't matter, you'll be rich. And that, I think, is the most fundamental point, which is we need to invest in the skills of the population. So I really applaud Prakerja and its accomplishments, but I want you to go farther than that, because it's not only some skill development, it's making sure that every child in this country, from pre-primary to secondary, lower and upper, and then to university, has every chance, financially and practically, to receive a quality education that is free, at least through upper secondary, and that is affordable at the university level. This is the core, the single most important investment that can be made. And by the way, quality counts. It's not only being in the classroom, but it's really learning. And there are metrics of quality, especially standardized tests on a comparative basis around the world. And my favorite is PISA, which is a program that Indonesia is part of, run by the OECD. And it measures school performance of 15-year-olds. And there are right now about 85 countries that are part of PISA, and Indonesia ranks around 70th on the rankings of science, math, and reading. And for Indonesia's future development, ranking 20th or 25th is your goal. In other words, a major improvement in scores and in performance of the 15-year-olds, I think, is one of the most, if not the single most important metric that this society could be following. And of course, it's possible. And it is rather amazing, by the way, if you look at the top 6 countries in PISA in the world, they're all your neighbors. So it's China, it's Taipei, it's Hong Kong, it's Singapore, it's Japan, it's Korea. I don't remember exactly the list, but it's 6. Every row. Then come some Europeans, European countries and so forth. But climb that ranking. That would be my first and probably the most important point that I could make in terms of strategy. The second area of investment is related to education. And by the way, education also at the higher levels means innovation, science, and technology. Every country should be investing at least 1% of GDP in R&D, but now 2, 3, 4% of GDP. Korea's up to 5% of GDP in research and development. And if you want private companies doing that, you need a very skilled technical workforce and a lot of public money invested in science and technology too, because they're complementary. The government invests something, then business adds, for the business side, its own investments. You can't do one without the other. So that's the first of the 6 categories that I want to mention. The second, and I'll go a little bit more quickly, is healthcare, and that means a safe, healthy upbringing for, again, every, not only a newborn, but even safe pregnancy, of course, for mothers and for the fetus, safe childbirth, the so-called critical 1,000 days for the infant, no stunting, no undernourishment, which still plagues many places in this country, because that's extremely debilitating for lifelong development. And then a public health system and a curative health system for the whole population. The third area of transformation is the greening of industry and the greening of the energy system. And this, of course, relates mostly to climate change and to pollution. But Indonesia is one of the world's largest coal producers, is going to have to change, because we're not going to be using coal in mid-century for almost anything. And so there just are not going to be coal exports coming from Indonesia, because there are not going to be coal imports anyplace. This is real. And that's also true for how the energy sector inside Indonesia is going to operate. Probably you'll need nuclear power. Probably you'll need wind, solar, geothermal. You've got a lot of different possibilities here. But planning the transformation to a post-fossil fuel world is real. It may not be so much fun for a country that depends heavily on fossil fuel resources, but it is reality. And the reality is not going away, because every year is going to be warmer, because the crisis is going to rise, because even if the politicians don't like it today, in 5 years or 10 years, the world's going to be running around as if it's the end of the world, because it's going to feel that way. And then there's going to be a crash course in energy system change, and the sooner this is being undertaken, the better for you, believe me. So this is the third area. And that means we're driving electric vehicles. It means the inter-island shipping is going to be electric. We're going to have different ships. We're going to have probably hydrogen fuel cell, large trucking, hydrogen, large oceanic transport, many, many basic but identifiable changes. The fourth area, extremely relevant for this country, is the sustainable land use. Indonesia's lost about 20% of its forest cover since the beginning of this century. That's a lot, and it continues. And I was in Sabah and Sarawak about 10 years ago to see a nature reserve. And so we were taken to a protected area. And as we were going on one side of the road, giant tropical logs were coming out, truck after truck after truck, the other way, from a protected area, so-called. It wasn't very convincing. It was 25 miles of trucks, biggest trees I had ever seen, no doubt all on their way to China. And so this is really a relentless and difficult problem. The incentives of the market are very clear. Cut down the trees. Palm oil is very profitable, and tropical hardwoods are very profitable. But it's devastating. And for many, many reasons, which you know and I won't go into. And so how we do agriculture, and fisheries, of course, because it's the same phenomenon, but on the coasts and in the oceans, we need really a deep change. And there's a lot of illegality, there's a lot of unrecorded activity, but there's also the ability to watch from the satellite every day what's going on. So it's not as if this stuff is happening without us knowing. It can all be monitored essentially in real time. It's a matter of management and rules and enforcement and setting the right framework. The fifth area is the urban infrastructure. Already Indonesia is about 60% urbanized. I think it was about 10% urban, this country upon independence. It's now about 60% urban, and according to the UN estimate, you'll be about 75% urban by mid-century. That's still a lot more people coming to the cities. And I know this is one of the big questions. More cities, new capital, and all the rest. Planning your urban space so it is livable, manageable, productive, green. Well, it's a common world challenge. And I think we're going to be remaking our cities a lot. The 20th century city was the automobile city, and the 21st century city is really going to reduce automobile use dramatically and find other ways to do things, including working from home or working from your local neighborhood, much less commuting, much more public transport, much more other modes of transport. But the sustainable design of cities is a fundamental fifth area. And the sixth area is the digital platforms, like Prakerja as a digital platform for education, but this is our best new class of technologies. These technologies are disruptive, they change jobs, they require different kinds of skills, they will eliminate a lot of jobs, but they'll also create much more effective education systems, more effective health systems, more effective urban logistics systems, more effective payment systems, more honest and transparent government because everything can be digitized. We will move to a cashless economy. Collecting taxes will actually be easier and should be easier, and so forth. So the digital platforms are absolutely essential, and every country that wants to be sustainably developed needs a universal access for digital services, both public and private. So 6 areas of investment: education, health, industry, agriculture, urban, and digital. It's a bit complicated because this is not a 1-year agenda or a 3-year agenda or a 5-year agenda, it's a 20-year agenda. And it requires a 20-year plan. It really is a generation-long plan. And it is an integrated, complicated strategy. So this is the only point I would add. There's nothing really simple about what I've said. It's all achievable, but it's not easy just to snap a finger and make a high-quality education system. And it's certainly not simple to snap a finger and make a zero-carbon power grid. But you can plan for it and then invest for it. And the planning is absolutely essential. And so this is probably my next main piece of advice. Make your 20-year plan. And you have an incoming administration, and that's always a good time to actually think fresh and think long-term. And by long-term, I mean at a generation scale. And this country will be celebrating its 100th anniversary of independence, and so thinking about the next 20 years to the 100th anniversary of independence is also a very good visioning exercise. But I mean something more than a vision. I mean a quantified strategy, something that has the fiscal policy built in and something that has the investments quantified in the energy sector or in transport or in digital infrastructure or in the ports or in the climate resilience areas at the coasts and so forth, built into this agenda. And that's what I urge every country to do. Now, let me add a couple more wrinkles to this challenge. Indonesia cannot make its energy system other than in an integrated manner with the neighborhood. And so for certain pieces of these investments, you really need the regional cooperation and regional investments, and then defining the region is also extremely important. So one thing that Professor Wing-Tai Wu and I have been working on for the past couple of years is academic teams from around ASEAN working on the energy sector transformation, and especially where should the interconnections be between Vietnam, Laos PDR, Cambodia, Thailand, Malaysia, Indonesia, Singapore, Brunei, Philippines. Should there be interconnections everywhere? Do some stand alone? What is the most effective way to make this energy sector transformation? And this is an extremely important point, and it may be that even ASEAN is too small to think through this entirely. Maybe it really is right, though the project is temporarily suspended. I don't think it's permanently gone. The idea of a major submarine cable with Australia, to my mind, is probably a good idea. They've got lots of desert in Western Australia, lots of sunshine. You've got a lot of clouds here, by the way. So solar is not quite as good in the equatorial rainforest regions. And it may be that having a grid that is an RCEP grid, not only an ASEAN grid, that in other words connects the ASEAN 10 plus Australia plus China, Korea, and Japan, would be a good idea. I'd like the engineers to give some advice on that. Is that feasible? Is that economically smart? Is that financeable? But I think that that is another example of the kind of question that needs to be asked. In some of the other areas, local is going to be fine and necessary. Schools tend to be local. Healthcare systems, local or island-based or national. But even in education, you need regional connectivity and international connectivity. Indonesia's universities should be even more closely programmatically linked to universities in the United States, in Europe, in China, in India, and in other regions, because this will also really help on quality and help on solving global problems as well. So a plan, a financing strategy, and regional integration wherever it is absolutely essential to do. Let me close with just a few remarks about the financing, because the bill for all of this is not small. The returns are very high. Investing in education is not cheap, for example. It's many percent of GDP. Maybe another 5 percentage points of GDP should be in your education budget. It seems impossible right now. Where would the fiscal space come for that? But I would tell you that the economic returns, not only the moral or the social returns, are enormous. For this country to grow rapidly, to sustain 5 or 6% per year growth for the next 30 years, has to be and can be achieved through a massive investment in education, but not at the levels of spending that you have now, at a much larger investment as a share of GDP. And the energy transformation is not cheap. The infrastructure transformation is not cheap. So all of this requires a lot of investment, At a global level, we're constantly saying we've moved from billions to trillions because the incremental investments that are needed at the global level are $4 or $5 trillion per year, most likely, if you include all countries of the world. But even that's not impossible because world output is more than $100 trillion. So maybe it's 4 or 5% of world output that should be devoted as an increment to these objectives. Maybe that's the answer. And that's achievable. We can invest another few percentage points of GDP. But we need financing to do it. So where does the financing come from? There are at least 2 points to make here. One is your budget framework. Indonesia is going to need to collect more revenues in the future to support higher levels of government spending, whether it's on education or health or infrastructure. So the revenue side of fiscal policy needs to be examined. According to the International Monetary Fund, Indonesia has revenues of around 16% of GDP right now. My guess is that by the time you reach the 100-year anniversary of independence in 2045, that should be at least 35% of GDP in government revenues. That's typical of high-income countries. There's lots of definitional issues of what gets counted as revenues, do provident funds and saving schemes, so I won't go into every little definitional issue of this. But definitely fiscal policy needs to adjust so that there can be larger government outlays in the future. But in addition to the revenues, I think there needs to be a borrowing strategy as well, both public and private borrowing. Fortunately, Indonesia is not a heavily indebted country. Again, according to the IMF data, the net debt to GDP ratio is under 40% for the public sector. That's pretty good. The United States is 100% of GDP. Japan, by the way, is about 150% of GDP in net debt. So you're still at very cautious levels of debt, but maybe the government will need to borrow more in order to finance critical investments in human capital and in infrastructure. And one of the things that will be extremely interesting and important and a major agenda item for Indonesia in the coming years, and Indonesia's already been a leader in this in its G20 and in the processes going forward, is making the global financial system fairer to countries like Indonesia, because this country pays too high interest rates for its borrowing, even though it's got better growth prospects and lower debt than countries like the United States, which have much higher debt, much slower growth, but pay much lower interest rates. This system is not right. It's not accurate. It's not fair. It gives too much privilege to the dollar and to the euro. It is going to change in the coming years, and I hope that Indonesia plays a significant role in the G20 processes, maybe with the BRICS countries, which are also very much engaged in this, and next year at the UN's Financing for Development Summit meeting, which will be June 30 to July 3 in Madrid, an every 10-year global conference to look at the global financial architecture. And this country also has been a pioneer of blended finance, of blending public and private financing in order to undertake major initiatives, for example, environmental sustainability. And this is a great area of leadership of this country, and one where I think Indonesia can play a very significant role, not only for Indonesia and the ASEAN neighborhood, but for the whole world, because blended financing strategies, mixing the public and the private sector to get the right mix is extremely important. And I'll conclude by just one very specific example of that. This year's G20, as you know, has the presidency in Brazil. And of course, President Lula and President Jokowi have been working closely together on this issue, from your G20 to the Brazil G20 through India. And so there's progress being made, but next year Brazil will host the climate conference as well. And that's going to be in the Amazon. It's going to be in the city of Belém at the mouth of the Amazon River. And it's going to focus on rainforests. And you are big in rainforests. And so the opportunity to work with Brazil on financing sustainable management of the world's rainforests will have a unique opportunity in 2025. And the partnership of Brazil, Indonesia, and the Congo Basin countries, all the world's equatorial rainforest countries, is a wonderful opportunity for the world.
Well, it is very significant. This Shanghai Cooperation Organization is, as you say, an initiative underway many years, led by the Asian countries, China, India, Russia, and many others. Belarus joined in this current meeting. And more of the world is basically saying we want a different security arrangement from the one that the U.S. has been promulgating. We want a different way to achieve collective security. We want actually more economic interconnectivity. And these are countries that often the U.S. says are enemies. They're not really enemies, but in the mindset of the security state, they are enemies, and they're going about their business, making progress, making a larger interconnected world in which the U.S. Has absented itself. So I think it is a very, very significant change that's underway. The fact that the mainstream media ignores it shows that they're basically ignorant of what's happening and not informing us.
As we speak, NATO leaders and foreign ministers are arriving in Washington, D.C. I don't know if this is Joe Biden's swan song or not, but it's a meeting of NATO. Somebody leaked a proposed conclusion of the meeting, and on that leaked document, I don't know if it's real or not, it says that NATO is of the belief that Ukraine's membership in NATO is inevitable. I mean, to make a statement like that is to be utterly, totally, completely ignorant of the past 2 years of world history, is it not?
Well, I would say not only is it not inevitable, I would say it is impossible. It is impossible because it will be resisted in every way, including up to complete disaster for the world, by Russia, which has said no to NATO enlargement to its border with Ukraine. And Russia will fight as necessary to prevent it. It will not happen. It is as realistic as saying that Joe Biden has it all together. These are just delusional, dangerous statements, though, because they basically are a way of prolonging yet another perpetual war of the United States that has no end at this point other than killing more and more Ukrainians.
What do you think will come out?
It's just so incredibly incompetent of the American political and security leadership. But of course, we literally have a leader who is not competent mentally to do this job. And we don't really know who calls any of these shots, but they don't make sense.
Well, whoever it is has not been elected by the public. It is not transparent. As you say, we don't even know who it is. I mean, Joe Biden may be signing documents, but it's hard to believe that he can rationalize to the decisions that he needs to make. Back to NATO. What do you think will come of this meeting? More bellicosity, more support for Ukraine, more dangers for Europe, more steps in the direction of World War III?
Right now, we are adrift, and we will be adrift for a while. Biden is not competent to be president. He's not competent to negotiate. This resistance to what cries out for negotiations with Russia, with China, with the Arab leaders over the war in the Middle East. We don't have any of it happening. But now we see, though I've been begging for it and calling for it for years, it probably could not happen with Biden in the state that he is in at this point. Of course, I do think he should not remain president, much less candidate for another 4 years in this state. So what's going to come out of this? We'll have continued war and instability, lack of clarity, and yes, the rhetoric continues almost on autopilot because this has been a long-term project that doesn't yet end, even though it's causing disaster. That long-term project of expanding NATO whenever, wherever the U.S. Deep state says it should go. One of the things that will be reemphasized at this NATO meeting is a decision taken last year, and absolutely disastrous as well, that NATO should be engaged with East Asia and with China as a threat to the West, supposedly, and thereby actually institutionalize a link of NATO with Japan, Korea, Australia, New Zealand. It's mind-boggling. NATO means North Atlantic. It should have ended in 1990 or 1991 when the Soviet Union was ending and had disbanded the Soviet military alliance. Now they're talking about expanding to East Asia. Absolutely mind-bogglingly wrong. I think one thing that I'd like people to understand is that if you add all of the population of the United States and Canada, the population of the United Kingdom, of the European Union, of Japan, Korea, Australia, New Zealand, and the few NATO countries that one would add to that, you arrive at something around 12 to 15% of the world population. When you ask me about the Shanghai Cooperation, that's the rest. Not all the rest, because there are other parts of the world also that don't want to have anything to do with this NATO business. But we're talking about such a small part of the world that pretends it runs the show, whereas 85% of the world is saying, what are you doing? Why the wars? Why the militarization? Why all this incredibly provocative talk? Why the taunting of China? Why the continuation of war in Ukraine when neutrality for Ukraine and a buffer space between NATO and Russia would solve problems for every one of the countries? That's what the rest of the world is asking. That's what I hear every day when I speak to leaders outside of this, even call it a NATO bubble, because, you know, when you're basically no more than 15% of the world population, you're talking to yourself and you're not listening to the rest of the world.
Very, very interesting observation. You're talking to yourself and you're not listening to the rest of the world. I'm going to guess that MI6, Mossad, and the CIA were at this SCO meeting, even though the mainstream media totally and completely ignored them. Let's go to Europe.
But I think if I could just add a word about that, because there's something specific also that's happening when we have, say, negotiations over the ceasefire, which doesn't ever happen, even though the UN Security Council has called for it in Gaza. Who are the U.S. negotiators, the Israeli negotiators, and so forth? It's the CIA, it's Mossad. It is actually the secret intelligence agencies and the secret armies that are running the show, and we see them visibly at these certain moments. Why are they negotiating? What happened to the diplomats? What happened to the State Department? What happened to the ministries of foreign affairs? They don't do the negotiations. It's the intelligence agencies. That's pretty telling, actually, for how the world is actually working right now.
You have an American president who is incapable of the leadership necessary. You have an Israeli prime minister at odds with his military and intelligent establishment, and at least half the public. I guess power abhors a vacuum. I do know of one negotiator for the United States who was born in Israel and fought for the IDF and has dual citizenship, Amos Hochstein. I wonder where his heart is in these negotiations. There's no sense picking on him at the moment. But before we get into
except to say that every approach that he has championed has failed,
right?
Because they have had a strategy that we're going to divide the Arab world once again. We can ignore the Palestinian right to self-determination that overwhelmingly is the call of the entire world. But the United States, Mr. Hochstein and others think it can be gamed. Again, they talk to themselves. They're not talking to the rest of the world.
Right.
And so we're in a kind of bubble in the U.S. foreign policy world right now that is delusional, absolutely unrealistic, and getting us deeper and deeper into war and into crisis.
One of the newcomers in D.C. is Sir Keir Starmer, the new British Prime Minister. I wish it were Jeremy Corbyn, but it's not. It's Keir Starmer, and I don't think there's going to be any change whatsoever in British foreign policy with respect to Gaza and with respect to Ukraine.
Well, he said so in the first minutes of his prime ministership. The UK basically has two characteristics. One, nostalgia for the British Empire, and so it's filled with its own delusions. And second, a decision taken decades ago, never do anything other than what the United States says, but cheerlead as much as you can for that. Right. And so it doesn't matter whether it's conservative or labor. This guy didn't take 5 minutes even to think, what do I do? Now I have the burdens of state. I'm engaged in a war. Do we have a look? Are there consultations? Are there opportunities for negotiation? No. From the first moment, it was, we maintain exactly the same course as the government that just went down to defeat. It's shocking. But that's because we don't think, we are just completely aligned with what the United States says we should do.
This goes back to George W. Bush and Tony Blair, does it not? This idea of Britain as America's poodle.
Well, it goes back before that, but that was an example of it, which is that Blair was told by George W. Bush Jr., we're going to invade Iraq on absolutely bizarre and phony premises. And Tony Blair said, good, we do the same. We join you. It didn't take a moment. They broke their own laws and their own processes. Later, the parliament investigated them for that. But that was not the start of this. That was the ongoing result of British foreign policy, which says just salute the United States.
How unstable is the government in France as we speak?
President Macron had recklessly talked about, of course, putting French troops into Ukraine, and he brushed aside risks of nuclear war and made remarkably strange statements in recent weeks, all sorts of bravado, and the French people were absolutely shocked, I think. And so both in the European Parliament elections of a few weeks ago, and then in the snap elections that Macron called in the face of his party's defeat, we have had a large part of the French electorate say, no, I don't want this, whether they voted for the right or the left. By the way, these terms barely mean anything anymore. These are kind of catcalls rather than real descriptions of these parties, because it turns out what we call the right doesn't want war. It used to be the right was the militaristic side, at least in some ways of using that term. So I just caution about the terms, but basically the French electorate on now two rounds of occasion have said we do not want to be more deeply engaged and at risk over the Ukraine war.
In 2 weeks, Prime Minister Netanyahu, regrettably, will be greeted as a hero on the floor of the House of Representatives by nearly everyone there. They've already determined that they're going to give him more than 55 standing ovations, so as to beat the record of 55 standing ovations the last time he was there. What do you think his goal is? Does he want to scare Congress, saber rattle about Iran?
Look, the basic goal of his party, Likud, going back to its founding, is what is called Greater Israel, which means never have a Palestinian state, dominate the Palestinian people, control all of the lands of Palestine, ethnically cleanse those lands if possible, do what is being done in Gaza, make life completely unlivable, as well as killing vast numbers of people in basic slaughter. So this has been the goal. This continues to be the goal. Of course, on the personal side, he wants the continuation of power and all the rest, but the basic political goal is that there should never be a state of Palestine. It is a goal that can only be pursued with the extraordinary violence, a violence that is tantamount to genocide by what looks to be a decision that will come from the International Court of Justice. It's a disaster, but to continue with that line means continued war and likely escalation of war, because now, in addition to Gaza, there's every possibility that there will be a full-fledged war on Israel's northern border with Lebanon, with Hezbollah. That would quite possibly trigger a war with Iran. Netanyahu, as you said, would love to pull the U.S. into a war with Iran. Like extremists in Ukraine, extremists in Israel want to use the U.S. Military power for their extremist ideologies and their extremist purposes. And if we had a functional president, the president would say, no, we're the United States, you don't use us, period. But we don't have a functioning presidency right now.
Since you and I were last together, two rather startling reports came out about Gaza. One in the well-respected British medical journal, The Lancet, saying that it is likely that 186,000 human beings are dead in the Gaza Strip. That's about 8% of the total population. The other report is from Haaretz, demonstrating conclusively by revealing emails and text messages that Israel did do what it calls the Hannibal option. And in fact, half the people who died on October 7th were murdered by the Israeli military. Let's start with the Lancet. Those numbers are almost incomprehensible, Professor Sachs, are they not? 186,000 dead by the hands of the IDF?
Well, we don't know yet until there's a full demographic assessment after this horrific war ends, but they're not shocking because we quote the number of 40,000, but that's the bodies pulled from the rubble. First, there are bodies under the rubble, and that has been frequently estimated to be another 10 to 15,000 who were not recovered from the Israeli mass bombing. Then there are the people who have been deprived of the basics to survive, the basics of shelter, the basics of water, the basics of food, and the basics of healthcare. So I've been saying when we have been discussing this, that the numbers are vastly higher. And I've thought, again, on very general principles and experience, that it was not implausible to talk about the well over 100,000 people that have died already. The fact that the Lancet says it can be up to 186,000 and so forth, therefore, is not really a huge surprise. It's a shock. It's a disaster. It is a reflection of a genocidal campaign, in my opinion, but it's not a shock from an analytical point of view.
Here's how flippant the American State Department is when confronted at a Q&A yesterday, cut number 14.
I wanted to ask you first if you read or heard about the Haaretz report on Israel employing the Hannibal directive on October 7th.
So I did see that report that moved over the weekend, and that's the limit of my knowledge of seeing that report from Haaretz.
Does that make you change your position or your perspective on what really happened that day, that the Israelis may be responsible for killing a majority of the people that died on that day?
Boy, it certainly does not, Saeed. I don't think there's any question. I don't think there's any question that it was Hamas. Just let me finish. I don't think it's any question it's Hamas that is responsible for the overwhelming number of deaths on October 7th.
Look, this is an administration that has a president that can't even utter a sentence, and they fake that. They have a fake spokesman of Admiral Kirby at the White House. They have this Miller guy at the State Department. There's all smirks. There's no seriousness. It's all lies. It's all narrative. It's just a disgrace that this is the United States of America, and that we have people of such shallowness and utter irresponsibility in positions of responsibility. There's no excuse for it.
I know there's
just no excuse for it. This is not even adult behavior.
Right.
You see this guy's face, by the way. It's all smirks.
They're unwilling
disgusting.
They're unwilling to confront painful truths, and it is their job. It is their job to do so. Let's go over to Ukraine before we finish. Prime Minister Orban of Hungary, who showed up in Kyiv in his capacity as the Prime Minister of Hungary, but also as the chair of the EU, I guess of their executive committee. You can correct me.
It's the presidency that rotates on a 6-month basis, and this 6 months, it's the Hungarians as the presidency of the European Union.
And Brussels went apoplectic when he went to Kyiv to try and talk them into negotiating. And then when he went to Russia, and Brussels said he doesn't have a mandate, and he said, go take a hike. I don't need a mandate. I can go talk to whoever I want. While he was there, he said, the EU, I don't know if he was in Kyiv or Russia at the time, the EU bureaucrats want war with Russia. Do you think he's right?
Well, first, I know Prime Minister Orban very well. He's extraordinarily intelligent. And by the way, I spent several hours with him recently discussing the situation in Ukraine. He's extraordinarily knowledgeable and experienced, not surprisingly, and has a very clear understanding about the history of this conflict, the sources of the conflict, the behavior of his fellow politicians, who tells the truth, who lies, who says one thing in public and another thing in private. It's extremely interesting. His visit to Moscow, first to Kiev, then to Moscow, and then to Beijing, is extremely meritorious. He's trying to find a way forward because he knows that what's coming out of Brussels is just absolute pablum, and again following a U.S. narrative that is being enunciated by a failed administration that no longer has a functioning president.
We're going to play two clips. One is President Putin. Let me find it. President Putin talking about his meeting with Prime Minister Orban, and the other is Prime Minister Orban talking about how rational President Putin is. So, Chris, cut number 3, and then you can follow it with cut number 5.
Ladies and gentlemen, considering the fact that since July the 1st, Hungary is the chair of the European Union, Mr. Orban and I exchanged opinions regarding the current situation between Russia and the European Union, which are at the all-time low right now. We spoke about possible principles of future possible security architecture in Europe. In general, our negotiations have been very timely and useful for both parties. Of course, Mr. Prime Minister offered the Western point of view, from the point of view of Ukraine's interest, among other things. We are very grateful to Mr. Prime Minister for visiting Moscow. We see this as an attempt to restore dialogue and to give an impetus to the dialogue. Thank you.
He is more than 100% a rational person. When he negotiates, when he starts to explain a point, when he makes a proposal, saying yes or no, he's super rational. How to say in Hungarian, cool-blooded, Cool-blooded. Low profile, cool-blooded, very cautious, punctually formation, discipline. So it's a real challenge to have a negotiation and to be prepared if you would like to keep the intellectual and political level of him.
In other words, he's the opposite of Joe Biden.
Well, but this is absolutely the case. It's, first of all, negotiation is what keeps us from blowing each other up, and we don't have it right now. Second, to be able to negotiate indeed means to be intellectually prepared and also able to function, to listen, to respond. We don't have that right now. It's extremely serious. I remember decades ago how we just mocked the Soviet Union when Brezhnev was really not functional anymore, and we just wondered what kind of decrepit political system would keep someone like that in power. We have a president that is not functional right now on a consistent basis. And what's amazing about it is how many people scurry to hide this most obvious and basic fact. So it not only is a direct disservice in a very dangerous situation to our own situation, but it exposes the whole pattern of lying and the routineness of the lying that goes on by our government.
Bima apain HP-nya nih Bima? Ini kenapa bisa loading terus dia m-bankingnya? Kok nggak tahu Mima apain tadi malam ini? Nanti Mima apa nggak upgrade iOS gak?